Picture this: the heat of the most terrifying battle in human history. The Kursk salient. The German Tigers are pressing forward like a wall, while legendary Soviet guns suddenly turn into useless scrap metal. Shells just bounce off the armor. Panic. Blood. Hopelessness. And in that moment, a Soviet sergeant decides to do something that, under wartime laws, is punishable by immediate execution in front of the formation. He starts breaking his own ammunition. This was called sabotage. It smelled of a tribunal. But it was this insane decision, criminal from the standpoint of regulations, that turned his cannon into a conveyor belt of death, burning 14 heavy tanks in a single battle. What deadly secret was hidden in 450 grams of gunpowder? And why, to defeat indestructible German steel, was it necessary to break all the laws of physics? Watch until the end. This story will overturn your understanding of the price at which victory was won. July 1943. The earth near Kursk wasn't just burning, it was vibrating, like the skin on a huge drum being beaten ceaselessly by thousands of steel hammers. The air had turned into a thick, scorching suspension of dust, soot, and the smell of burnt cordite. You couldn't breathe it, you could only choke on it. On the far horizon, in the haze distorting the skyline, gray boxes crawled forward. They moved slowly, with that terrifying calm unique to machinery convinced of its absolute invulnerability. The crew of the ZIS-3 gun froze. The men had turned into appendages of the mechanism, faces black with soot, tunics soaked in salt that corroded skin into ulcers. The gunner pressed against the panoramic sight, his eye watering from the acrid smoke, but his hand on the flywheel didn't tremble. This wasn't courage. It was mechanical muscle memory, honed to automatism. "Range, 600!" The crew commander's voice broke into a rasp. "Armor piercing!" "Aim for the front!" The loader, a guy of about 20, whose hands were rubbed raw and bloody against the breech, slammed a unitary cartridge into the chamber with a clang. The breech block clicked, cutting this world off from the primer, ready to unleash death. "Fire!" The 76mm divisional gun jerked, its spades biting into the dry earth. The barrel flew back, absorbing the monstrous recoil energy. The roar struck the ears, shutting down hearing for a moment. But more terrifying than the sound of the shot was the sound that rang out a second later. It wasn't an explosion, and not the dull thud signifying penetration. It was a high-pitched, screeching grind, the sound of metal giving up. The BR-350 armor-piercing shell, accelerated to a speed of over 600 meters per second, struck the frontal plate of the German heavy tank. The physics of the process at that moment were merciless. The blunt-nosed Soviet shell carried enough kinetic energy to smash through the side of any medium tank from previous years. But before it stood a tiger. 100 millimeters of cemented Krupp steel. At the point of impact, the metal of the shell experienced an overload exceeding its yield strength. But the German armor proved harder. The shell didn't bite in. It swam. Its nose deformed, lost energy, and striking sparks of useless fire went into a ricochet, howling like a wounded animal. "Ricochet!" screamed the gunner. There was not just frustration in his voice, but primal terror. "It's not piercing, the bastard! It's not piercing!" The tank didn't even slow down. The 60-ton behemoth continued to crawl forward, grinding bushes and soil under its tracks. The tank's turret began to turn slowly, with the lazy grace of a predator, toward the flash of the shot. The long barrel of the 88mm gun sought its victim. This was the very steel dead end that Soviet artillery had hit in the summer of '43, a crisis the newspapers didn't write about, but which every artilleryman who had survived on the front line for more than 3 days knew. Our guns, considered gods of war only yesterday, had suddenly turned into useless firecrackers. The WWII, legendary, reliable, unfailing, was magnificent against infantry and light vehicles, but against the new German armor, it was powerless at standard combat ranges. Loss statistics in tank destroyer regiments that month jumped to a monstrous 30%. Every third crew perished before managing to inflict significant damage on the enemy. It wasn't a war of maneuver. It was a slaughter, where one side had a shield and sword, and the other had only courage and a manual that prescribed shooting, even if physics said no. "Load! 500 meters! Sub-caliber!" shouted the commander, though he understood that even this might not work. Sub-caliber shells were scarce, guarded like the apple of one's eye. But at this range, they lost velocity faster than regular solid shots. The loader darted to the crates. 50 kilograms of wood and metal seemed impossible to lift. His fingers slipped on the casing. Every movement cost a second, and a second here cost the life of the entire crew. The German gunner in the Tiger worked calmly. The dust didn't bother him. He was protected by armor the Russian shells couldn't bite through. He saw the target through excellent optics, the small shield of the Soviet gun sticking out among the brush. For him, it was just a target, a training target on a range. The tank turret froze. The black eye of the muzzle brake stared straight into the soul of the Soviet gunner. "Fire!" shouted the German commander somewhere inside the steel box. The Tiger's shell weighed almost 10 kilograms. It flew at a speed that turned the air into a shock wave. Upon hitting the shield of the WWII, the kinetic energy of this monster didn't just punch through the 5mm steel protection. It tore the metal apart, turning the shield itself into shrapnel that killed its own defenders. The impact was of such force that the gun was tossed like a toy. The trails were wrenched from the earth. The shield cover burst, and thousands of red-hot fragments sprayed inside, into the flesh of men who a second ago were trying to achieve the impossible. Ringing. An unbearable, high-pitched ringing in the ears, drowning out all other sounds. The world turned upside down. The ground hit the back. The smell of blood instantly mixed with the smell of burnt rubber and TNT. The gunner lay on his back, looking at the sky, which was indifferently blue through clouds of black smoke. He tried to inhale, but his chest wouldn't obey. Instead of air, a warm, salty liquid flowed into his throat. His hand, which had just been gripping the flywheel, now lay separately in the dust, like a forgotten tool. Somewhere nearby, the loader was screaming. The scream was monotonous, on one note, turning into gurgling. The commander was silent. He was simply gone. A direct hit by a high-explosive shell on the breech leaves no chance for a biological object. The Tiger, clanking its tracks, drove past the mangled gun. It didn't even bother finishing off the survivors with its machine gun. Why waste ammo on garbage? The tank moved on, deeper into the defense, to where thousands of other such crews realized with horror their weapons were obsolete. Their doctrine didn't work. Their lives were simply time that needed to be bought until someone in the rear figured out how to smash this cursed German steel. Darkness covered the gunner's consciousness slowly, like a heavy cotton blanket. His last thought was not a memory of home nor fear. It was a cold, detached statement of fact. We couldn't do anything. Physics was simply on their side. And then came silence. Absolute, black silence, in which there was no war, no pain, no clanking of tracks, only endless, cold darkness. While the front line choked on blood, 3 kilometers from the front, in the thin shadow of a camouflage net, another war was being waged. A war with metal, Senior Sergeant Gromov didn't hear the groans of the wounded. His world had narrowed to the clang of steel and the smell of gun oil, thick and black as crude. He was stripping the bolt of his cannon. It was dirty, physically heavy work. Gromov wiped the breech wedge with a rag, cleaning off carbon, sand, and fine metal shavings, traces of the extreme loads of recent days. His fingers, calloused and covered in indelible grease, moved with the precision of a surgeon operating in the field. But his eyes looked through the metal. Gromov was a tech guy. Before the war, he didn't learn how to kill. He learned how to make steam locomotives work. He was a boiler shop foreman at the depot. There, in the world of steam and pressure, he learned the main law of mechanics. Any vessel has a breaking point. If steam pressure exceeds the resistance of the boiler walls, an explosion occurs. If the pressure is too low, the mechanism won't budge. For him, war was the same shop floor, only instead of steam, they used gunpowder gases, and the price of a mistake was measured not in defective goods, but in death notices. He set the heavy breech wedge down on a crate. One thought pounded in his head, intrusive as a toothache. Armor-piercing shells don't work. The kinetic energy of the 76mm slug just shatters against Krupp steel. It was a dead end, a technical defeat. But Gromov knew that in mechanics, there are no hopeless situations. There are only incorrectly selected tools. In the corner of the improvised workshop, covered by a tarp, lay crates that the quartermasters looked at with horror. Cumulative shells. Steel cylinders filled not just with explosives, but with tricky physics. Their operating principle was different. They didn't need speed. They didn't need acceleration. Upon impact with armor, the explosives inside the shell collapsed into a thin needle of molten metal and gases. This cumulative jet burned through armor like a blowtorch burns through butter, creating hellish pressure inside the tank. But there was a nuance, a terrifying nuance written in red ink in the manual. Firing cumulative shells from the ZIS-3 cannon was categorically forbidden. "Sergeant," the raspy voice of the young loader pulled him from his thoughts. The boy was holding out a can of grease. "Maybe we should forget it? If the commissar sees us messing with the ammo—" "Quiet," Gromov snapped shortly, not raising his head. "The commissar won't shield you from a tiger." The problem was the barrel. The divisional gun's long barrel accelerated the shell too much. High pressure in the bore and furious torque could tear the thin-walled cumulative ammunition apart before it even left the muzzle, or strip it from the rifling. At best, a miss. At worst, a barrel burst and the death of the entire crew. These shells were intended for short-barreled regimental guns, which spat them gently and not far. Gromov took a casing in his hands. The brass cooled his palm. He looked at it not as a soldier, but as an engineer. If the problem is pressure, then the pressure must be changed. The equation was simple, but the solution required criminal boldness. The charge needed to be reduced. He looked around. People were bustling about, someone dragging crates, someone bandaging a head. No one cared about a sergeant tinkering with ammunition. Gromov took out pliers. The metal squeaked as he bent back the edges of the casing neck. He pulled out the shell. Inside, dully gleaming, lay the macaroni strands of artillery gunpowder. The deadly risk lay not only in the shell potentially getting stuck in the barrel due to lack of pressure. The risk was that he was violating a direct order of the People's Commissariat of Defense. Unauthorized alteration of the propellant charge was punishable by tribunal. It was called sabotage. Gromov poured some of the powder onto his palm. He didn't weigh it on scales. There were no scales. He weighed it in his hand, relying on the muscle memory of a master who for years determined coal quality by the weight of a shovel. He needed to leave exactly enough to push the shell out of the long barrel, but not tear it apart with centrifugal force. To make a powerful long-range gun into, essentially, a large howitzer for firing at point-blank range.
"What are you doing, Sarge?"
whispered the loader, his eyes widening with horror. He understood that a crime was taking place. "Do you want to live?" Gromov didn't ask. He stated, "If you want to live, you'll hand me these cucumbers quickly." He poured off about a third of the charge. 700 grams of death turned into 450. Carefully, trying not to spill a single grain on the ground, he returned the shell to the casing and crimped the edges with a hammer. The sound of metal striking metal drowned in the distant rumble of cannonade. Now it was no longer standard ammunition. It was a homemade hybrid, born of desperation and engineering ingenuity. Gromov held the key to German armor in his hands. But this same key could become a death sentence for himself. If the calculations were wrong, if there was too little powder, the shell would get stuck. If too much, an explosion. He repeated the operation. Another casing, another shell. His hands worked automatically, uncrimping, pouring off, crimping. With every finished cartridge, fear receded, giving way to cold, angry excitement. This was no longer just a war of infantry and tanks. It was a duel of designers. Krupp engineers who created indestructible armor, and the Russian mechanic Gromov, who decided to cheat physics in field conditions. A pile of poured-off powder grew around him, black cylinders looking like pieces of pencil lead. Gromov scooped them into a rag and buried them in the ground. Evidence. "Not a word to anyone," he said, wiping his oily hands on his pants. "For everyone else, we're shooting standard. Understood?" The loader nodded. He was pale, but something new appeared in his eyes. Hope. Gromov reassembled the bolt, slamming the wedge into place with a clang. The mechanism worked crisply, with a predatory click. The gun was ready. It ceased to be just a tool working according to regulations. Now it was a mechanism working at the limit of material resistance, tuned to the frequency of its commander's madness. Gromov looked at the horizon, where columns of smoke were rising again. The tigers were coming there, invulnerable, terrifying, self-assured. They believed in the thickness of their armor. They believed in the calculations of their engineers. They didn't know that 3 kilometers away from them, a sergeant with dirty hands had just rewritten the rules of ballistics, turning his cannon into a giant sawed-off shotgun. The idea was ready. The most terrifying part remained, testing it in practice. A shot that would either kill them all or give them a chance to survive in this hell. Gromov lit a cigarette, hiding the glow in his fist. His hands no longer trembled. There was the clarity of a blueprint in his head. Now he just needed a target. June 1943. The training ground, 30 kilometers from the front, breathed a deceptive calm. Bullets didn't whistle here. An explosion sounded rarely and on schedule. But for Senior Sergeant Gromov, this silence was heavier than the cannonade. He led his crew to the very edge of the range, to a ravine where the rusting hulk of a captured German Panzer III tank lay, turned into a sieve by hundreds of practice slugs. Gromov acted quickly. He knew they had only a few minutes while the brass was busy reviewing firing drills in another sector. "Load," he commanded quietly. The loader held that same modified shell in his hands. The casing with the cut charge seemed light, almost weightless compared to standard armor-piercing rounds, but inside it was death. Death either for the German tank or for the crew itself. If Gromov miscalculated and poured off too little powder, the shell would jam in the barrel bore. The next shot would blow the gun to shreds. If there was too much powder, the thin walls of the cumulative grenade wouldn't withstand the overload during acceleration in the ZIS-3's long barrel. The explosion would happen right in the breech. The crew froze. The men stepped further away from the gun than regulations prescribed. They were afraid. Not of the enemy, but of their own weapon. Gromov remained by the trails alone. He pulled the lanyard himself. The shot sounded wrong. The artilleryman's ear, accustomed to the sharp, cracking strike of an armor-piercing round, caught a strange, dull sound. It wasn't the crack of atmosphere being torn, but a heavy, guttural exhale. The barrel rolled back softly, lazily, as if the gun didn't want to shoot. The fire from the muzzle brake wasn't as bright, the smoke thicker and blacker. A second of silence seemed like an eternity. The shell, flying at half the standard speed, was almost visible to the eye. It described a steep arc and struck the side of the rusty tank.
There was no explosion in the usual sense. There was a pop and a bright, blindingly white flash that instantly extinguished. No spraying of shrapnel, no howl of a ricochet. The shell simply vanished upon contact with the armor. Gromov was the first to run to the target. Boots slipped on the dry grass. His heart pounded somewhere in his throat. He had to see the result. He had to know if the risk of a tribunal was worth this dull pop. He stopped at the tank's side and ran his hand over the metal. The armor was warm. In the center of the 30mm plate gaped a hole. It was small, no bigger than a large coin. The edges of the hole weren't jagged, like from an armor-piercing round, but melted, smooth, as if someone had poked the steel with a giant's red-hot finger. Around the hole, the metal had turned blue from monstrous heat. Gromov looked inside. What he saw made his back break out in a cold sweat. Inside the tank, everything was black. The mannequin representing the tanker had disappeared. Only burnt rags of a quilted jacket remained of it. The old paint on the opposite wall had burned to ash. This was the physics of the cumulative effect, which Gromov, a simple tech, understood intuitively. Upon impact, the explosive inside the shell detonated. The copper cone collapsed, turning into a thin jet of liquid metal, flying at a speed of several kilometers per second. Pressure at the point of impact reached millions of atmospheres. The armor wasn't pierced, it was washed away, like sand by a jet of water. The jet, bursting inside, brought with it temperature and pressure that instantly killed everything living through pressure difference and fire. "Mother of God," whispered the gunner who had walked up. He looked at the neat little hole in the armor with superstitious horror. "What is this, Comrade Sergeant? How can it be?" Without acceleration.
"It doesn't need acceleration." Gromov straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. His hands were still trembling slightly, but now it was the tremor of adrenaline from victory. "Speed is harmful to it. The main thing is to deliver it. Chemistry will sort it out from there." "But it's forbidden," said the loader quietly, staring at the hole as if spellbound. "If they find out we changed the charge, it's the firing squad. Do you want to lie under the tigers tomorrow according to the manual?" Gromov turned sharply to the soldier. His face, smeared with soot, became hard. "This hole is your only chance to return home. Understood?" The crew was silent. The soldiers exchanged glances. They had seen death in all its forms, seen torn limbs and crushed bodies. But this quiet, surgical death enclosed in a small hole frightened them with its novelty. It was a weapon not of strength, but of mind. Sneaky from the standpoint of chivalry, but devilishly effective from the standpoint of survival. "Here's the plan," Gromov's voice became metallic, like that breech wedge he cleaned yesterday. "We prepare the entire stock, at night, while no one is looking. Disassemble, pour off, crimp. Charge weight, 450 grams. Not a gram more, not a gram less. Make a mistake, we all die together, right at the position." The noise of an approaching truck engine was heard in the distance. "Places!" barked the sergeant. "Pretend we're cleaning the barrel. Cover this hole with mud. Move!" The soldiers darted to the gun. Gromov remained standing by the pierced side for another second. He touched the melted edge with his finger. The metal still burned his skin. It was the burn of truth. The manual was written in the blood of past wars. But a new war, a war of motors and thick armor, could not be won by old rules. They returned to camp in silence. Each of them carried a secret that weighed more than a 50-kilogram crate of shells. Now they knew. Tigers could be killed. But to do that, one first had to kill the fear of instructions within oneself. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky the color of coagulated blood. July was approaching. The air was becoming dense with the expectation of great trouble. But now, in Gromov's pocket lay a trump card. A marked, forbidden, deadly dangerous trump card. And he intended to play it at the very first deal. The night of July 11th brought no darkness. The sky over Prokhorovka pulsed with a sickly crimson light from thousands of flares and distant glows. The horizon trembled, erasing the boundary between earth and air. Artillery preparation didn't cease for a minute. It wasn't just noise, it was physical pressure, dense as water at depth, pressing men into the bottoms of trenches, forcing eardrums to work at the limit of pain threshold. Senior Sergeant Gromov sat at the bottom of the ammo niche. Before him lay 8 modified shells. 8 chances. 8 shots. This was not enough. Catastrophically little for what was advancing on them from the west. Intelligence reported a concentration of hundreds of motors. Gromov understood the mechanics of the coming battle better than the political officer. Tomorrow their position would simply be crushed, smeared by tracks, if he didn't turn his gun into a continuous conveyor belt of death. The standard armor-piercing rounds, of which there were plenty, would become just useless ballast tomorrow. He needed the shaped charges. "Savelyev, follow me." Gromov kicked the loader sleeping in half-consciousness. "Take a duffel bag, and the knife." They crawled out of the shelter like rats leaving a burrow. Direction, the destroyed positions of the neighbors, the 5th Battery, which yesterday took an airstrike and went silent. There, among the churned earth and craters, ammunition should have remained. The quartermasters hadn't had time to remove what survived. Moving at full height was suicide. The air over the field was saturated with shrapnel. Stray mortar shells fell chaotically, kicking up fountains of dry, hot earth. Gromov crawled first, pressing into the soil so hard that his tunic buttons seemed to grow into his body. The whistle of a mortar shell is a sound impossible to confuse with anything else. It is the sound of the fabric of the universe tearing. "Keep your head down," he hissed, when Savelyev tried to lift up to crawl over a fallen tree. The flash of a close explosion blinded them for a moment. The earth under their elbows shuddered, hitting the ribcage. A sharp, nauseating smell of TNT and fresh, damp clay hit their noses. Fear was cold and sticky. It trickled down the back with sweat, making muscles go stiff. But more terrifying than fear was responsibility. If they didn't bring the shells, tomorrow's dawn would be their last. They reached the 5th Battery's positions in 40 minutes. It was a graveyard of machinery. Twisted carriages, barrels tied into knots by the unknown force of an explosion. And silence. A terrible, dead silence that exists only where there is no one left to scream. Gromov found what he was looking for in a half-buried dugout. Standard wooden crates reinforced with iron. On the lids, markings indicating cumulative charges. "Grab it," he commanded. The crate weighed 50 kilograms. In normal life, at a warehouse, 2 men would carry it by the handles. Here, lying in the mud, under the whistle of bullets, this weight seemed beyond limits. 50 kilograms of inert mass that snagged on every root, every stone. The wood of the crate was wet with night dew and slippery with mud. They dragged it. Gromov pushed, Savelyev pulled. The rope cut their hands. Breathing broke into wheezing. Every 5 meters, a stop.
Hearts pounded so hard it seemed their beat could be heard by German observers. "Patrol!" Gromov pressed Saveliyev's face into the mud. 100 meters away, along the road, a commandant's squad passed. If they were caught now, with a crate of shells far from their position, at night, there would be no investigation. Looting, abandoning a post, execution on the spot by the nearest pine tree. The regulations were cruel, but war was crueler. Gromov knew he was violating a dozen paragraphs right now, but he also knew those paragraphs were written by people who had never burned tigers at point-blank range. The patrol passed. Gromov felt the loader's hands trembling. "Don't panic, son," he whispered, though his own mouth was dry. "A tribunal is a maybe, but the tanks tomorrow are a sure thing. Pull." The way back took an eternity. Back muscles burned with fire. Sweat flooded eyes, stinging them with salt. The crate became their personal cross to bear to Golgotha. The physics of the process were simple. Work against gravity and friction force, multiplied by a coefficient of mortal risk. When they tumbled into their trench, the sky in the east was already beginning to turn gray. Pre-dawn gloom, the most dangerous time. Hands wouldn't unbend. Fingers were cramped. They resembled crooked roots. But resting was impossible. "Tools!" Gromov dropped shortly, knocking the lid off the crate with a crowbar. Inside, in oiled paper, lay the shells. Cold, heavy, lethal. Now began the second part of the operation, the most delicate. Right there in the trench, on his knees, Gromov began his dangerous ritual. Unbend the casing petals. Remove the shell. Pour off powder. Weigh in hand. Return the shell. Crimp. There was a terrible meditation in this monotonous work. Gromov didn't think about how hell would break loose in a couple of hours. He thought only about grams of gunpowder. 450 grams. A little more. Explosion. A little less. Shortfall. His hands, which had just been dragging weight, now moved with the caution of a jeweler. Savelyev handed him the shells silently. He looked at the commander not as a sergeant, but as a shaman casting a spell on death. Around them, in the pre-dawn silence, tension was building. The earth began to vibrate with a fine tremor. This was the tank armada warming up engines on the other side of the front. Thousands of pistons moved in cylinders, compressing a mixture of gasoline and air, preparing to turn this energy into track movement. By the time the first ray of sun hit the parapet, they had 20 shells ready. 20 shots with a reduced charge. 20 capsules of liquid fire. Gromov wiped his hands with a rag. His palms were black with graphite gunpowder dust. He looked at his fingers. These hands had just committed a military crime, stole ammunition, and damaged government property. But these very hands would hold the defense of the entire country on a 500-meter sector today. "Battle stations," he said quietly, taking his place at the panoramic sight. The earth shuddered for real. It began. The distant rumble grew into a roar. The horizon began to move. A steel avalanche was coming at them, confident in its invulnerability. But Gromov knew what the German tankers didn't. The equation had changed. X was no longer an unknown. X was equal to 450 grams of gunpowder and the rage of one Russian sergeant. The dawn of July 11th, 1943, met them not with birdsong, but with infrasound. It was a tremor coming from the very depths of tectonic plates. The horizon disappeared. Instead, on the western side of the field, a wall of dust rose, kicked up by thousands of tracks. Through this gray veil, silhouettes emerged. Square, heavy, inevitable. This wasn't an attack. It was a migration of steel. The Tigers moved in a wedge.
They didn't shoot. They simply crushed space with their weight. The distance closed with frightening speed. 1,000 meters. 800. On a normal day, regulations required opening fire at a kilometer, with armor-piercing rounds. Try to knock off a track, damage optics. But today, Gromov had different arithmetic. His sawed-off gun with a weakened charge was effective only at pistol range. If he fired now, the shell would just nosedive into the ground halfway there. He needed to let them get to point-blank range. "Hold!" Gromov's voice drowned out the roar of engines. "Don't shoot! Wait for the command!" The gunner pressed his forehead against the sight pad so hard his skin turned white. In the eyepiece, the German tank grew, filling the entire field of view. Rivets on the armor, spare tracks, even jerry cans tied to the rear were visible. 600 meters. 500. The ground at the position jumped. Clods of dry clay poured down collars. The fear in the trench was thick. You could cut it with a knife. It was the primal terror of a creature of flesh and blood before an advancing mountain of metal. Nerves sang like taut strings. One wanted to drop everything, jump out of the trench, and run. Run until the heart burst. 400, exhaled Gromov. The Tiger turned its turret. The black pupil of the barrel looked straight at them. Now it would fire. Now it would turn them into bloody dust. Fire! The command sounded simultaneously with the clank of the breech. Again that strange, dull, wrong sound of the shot. The cannon spat fire. The shell, heavy and slow, went on a flat trajectory. A second of flight stretched into eternity. Impact. On the frontal armor of the Tiger, a tiny, blindingly white star blossomed. The cumulative jet, accelerated by the explosion to cosmic speeds, struck the steel. 100 millimeters of Krupp armor didn't exist for it. The jet passed through the metal like a needle through wax. Inside the tank, pressure spiked instantly. The jet of molten copper and gases burst into the fighting compartment. It hit the shell rack. The detonation of a heavy tank's ammo load is a physical phenomenon of monstrous beauty and cruelty. The 60-ton machine shuddered. Tongues of flame, looking like welding torches, burst from all hatches, slits, and observation devices. And then, the laws of gravity were repealed. The multi-ton turret of the Tiger, torn from the ring by the internal explosion, flew into the air, tumbling like a tossed coin, and crashed down next to the hull with a roar. "Got him!" screamed the gunner, not hearing himself. "Load!" Gromov hit Savelyev on the shoulder. "Move it! Next!" The death conveyor started working. There was no time for thought. There was only rhythm. Heavy, exhausting rhythm of hard labor. Open the bolt. Eject the smoking casing. Grab a shell. ram it home. Close. Aim. Fire.
The air at the position became red hot. Heat radiated from the breech like from an open furnace. Paint on the barrel began to bubble and peel, revealing bluish metal. Acrid smoke ate at eyes. Savelyev worked like an automaton. His tunic darkened with sweat, sticking to his back. His face turned into a black mask with white circles around the eyes. 50 kilograms of ammunition passed through his hands every minute. Muscles clogged with lactic acid, they burned, demanding a stop. But a stop meant death. The second tank flared up like a torch 30 seconds later. The cumulative jet stitched through the side and ignited the fuel tanks. The German crew began bailing out of hatches, living torches rolling on the ground. Gromov didn't look at them. For him, they weren't people, but neutralized units of enemy personnel. Left 05, fire! The third shell went wide. The gunner's hand trembled. Shortfall. The shell buried itself in the ground in front of a panther's track. The tank began to turn, exposing its front. "Steady!" barked Gromov, feeling panic covering the crew like an icy wave. "Correct! Higher! Hit the turret ring!" The next shot was accurate. Screeching metal, and the Panther's turret jammed. The tank spun in place, losing control. The battle turned into a bloody meat grinder on a patch of 500 square meters. Gromov lost count of time. Had 20 minutes passed, or 20 years? A continuous ringing stood in his ears. Blood flowed from his nose due to constant pressure changes from the shots. He licked it from his lips, tasting the salty flavor of iron. Casings clinked underfoot. There were so many it was hard to walk on them. Savelyev stumbled, fell to his knees, dropping a shell. "Get up!" Gromov jerked him up by the collar. "Don't you dare die! Work!" They worked at the limit of human capabilities, and beyond that limit. It was the anatomy of heroism, devoid of romance. Fingers rubbed to meat, torn nails, burns from hot casings. The loader wheezed, coughing up his lungs, but continued to drive death into the breach. Iron burned all around. The field in front of their position turned into a junkyard of history. 14 steel monsters, which just this morning seemed the pinnacle of the Reich's technical thought, were now just a pile of scrap metal. Some billowed greasy black smoke. Others stood with torn-off turrets. Third ones froze, burying guns in the ground as if bowing. The smell of burning flesh, rubber, and diesel mixed into a thick, unbearable stench. This was the smell of victory. Not solemn and clean, but dirty, nauseating, and heavy. The last shell was rammed into the barrel. Gromov looked into the sight. There were no more targets in the sector. Those who survived backed away, covering themselves with smoke grenades. The German attack choked on blood and oil. "Cease fire!" rasped Gromov. His voice wouldn't obey. His throat felt like it was stuffed with broken glass. He slid down the trail to the ground. His hands shook with a fine, nasty tremor. He looked at his gun. It was smoking. Steam rose from the barrel. It was no longer just a mechanism. It was a beast they had driven half to death, but which had done its job. Silence returned slowly, reluctantly breaking through the ringing in ears. Gromov took out a tobacco pouch. Fingers couldn't roll a cigarette. Paper tore, tobacco spilled. Savelyev lay on his back, arms spread, staring at the sky with empty eyes. His chest heaved, sucking in air with a whistle. They were alive. Against regulations, against physics, against the logic of war. Around them, 14 tigers and panthers burned out, destroyed by a violation of instruction numbers such and such. But Gromov knew the most terrifying part was still ahead. When the smoke cleared, the brass would arrive, and then he would have to answer not to tanks, but to men with cornflower blue collar tabs.
The battle died down as suddenly as it had begun, as if someone had switched off the breaker of war. The rumble of engines receded to the west, leaving behind only the crackle of burning metal and heavy, greasy smoke hugging the ground. The silence that fell on the position was deafening. It pressed on the ears harder than the cannonade. Senior Sergeant Gromov stood by the gun. He couldn't walk away. His hands, cramped, still gripped the trail leg, as if it were the only anchor point in a spinning universe. Heat radiated from the cannon. The red-hot barrel metal cooled, emitting ringing clicks, metal contracting, returning to its original state after monstrous thermal expansion. The paint on the breech had burned off completely, exposing blued steel. Gromov looked at his hands. They were black, covered in a crust of gunpowder soot, oil, and blood mixture.
He tried to unclench his fingers, and it responded with sharp pain in the joints. 100 meters in front of him burned the graveyard of German ambitions. 14 bonfires, 14 steel boxes that an hour ago were the peak of technological progress. Now it was scrap. From the turret hatch of the nearest Tiger hung the body of a tanker, looking like a broken doll. Fire lazily devoured the black coveralls. The sound of an engine cut through the cottony silence. Not a tank diesel, but the light, nervous buzz of a gasoline engine. From behind the smokescreen, a Willis jumped out, bouncing on craters like a maddened goat. The vehicle braked sharply at the position, tearing up loose earth with its wheels. Colonel Yermakov stepped out of the jeep, the regiment commander. Gromov felt everything inside him turn cold. This cold was more terrifying than a German sight. In battle, you risk your life, but your death is honorable. Here, now, he risked his honor and his name. Yermakov was known for his harshness. The regulations were holy scripture to him, and any deviation was heresy.
The colonel slowly walked up to the gun. His uniform was dusty, but his collar liner remained white, creating a contrast with the trench mud that hurt the eyes. He didn't look at the soldiers. He looked at the battlefield. Yermakov took out binoculars. He counted the burning machines long and methodically. His lips moved. 14, he said, lowering the binoculars. His voice was dry, devoid of emotion. And 2 panthers detracked. He turned to Gromov. The colonel's gaze was heavy, scanning. He saw everything. The haggard faces of the crew, the mountain of spent casings, the loader's trembling hands. Your work, Sergeant? Yes, Comrade Colonel. Gun crew number 3. Yermakov walked closer. His boots crunched on casings. Suddenly he stopped. His gaze caught on something on the ground. He bent down and picked up one of the casings. It was evidence.
Irrefutable proof of a crime. The edges of the casing neck were uneven, with traces of rough mechanical work with pliers. The primer was struck, but the casing itself screamed of makeshift interference. The colonel turned the brass cylinder in his hands. He was an artilleryman of the old school. He knew the weight of gunpowder by touch. He saw traces of double crimping. He understood everything instantly. "What is this?" asked Yermakov quietly, raising the casing to Gromov's eye level. Silence hung in the trench, in which one could hear ash falling from a cigarette. Savelyev stopped breathing. The gunner lowered his eyes. Everyone understood. Fate was being decided now. Not their lives were already worth nothing, but their meaning. "It's a necessity, Comrade Colonel." Gromov looked straight into the commander's eyes. His voice was hoarse, broken, but firm. "Standard rounds don't penetrate. They ricochet. We poured off the charge, Fired at point blank.
Do you realize what you've done?" Yermakov spoke slowly, separating words. You violated Order Number 0391 of the People's Commissariat of Defense. Unauthorized alteration of ammunition. That's sabotage. Tribunal. Execution in front of the formation. Yes, I understand. Gromov didn't avert his gaze. But if I hadn't done it, you would be talking to a German Hauptmann right now, and my boys would be lying flattened into pancakes. The regulations forbade touching shells, but German tanks forbade us to live. I chose life. Yermakov was silent. He looked at the sergeant, then shifted his gaze to the casing in his hand, then again at the burning tigers. A struggle was going on in his head, invisible but cruel. A struggle between an officer obligated to punish for arbitrariness and a commander who needed results. On one scale lay the regulations, the iron order on which the army stands. On the other, 14 destroyed heavy tanks, whose breakthrough could have cost the division its existence. Gromov had committed a crime. Technically, he was a criminal. Factually, he was a hero who had groped for a way out of a dead end. The colonel squeezed the casing in his fist so hard his knuckles turned white. The heat was unbearable. Sweat ran down Yermakov's face, leaving light tracks on dusty skin. "Did you inspect the barrel?" he asked unexpectedly in a businesslike tone. "Yes. Rifling is clean, no bulging, pressure normal. We calculated, Comrade Colonel. I'm a locomotive master. I know how pressure works. 450 grams. Yermakov chuckled. It was a strange sound, like a cough. He looked once more at the field strewn with burning metal. This view was the sergeant's best lawyer. No prosecutor could object to 14 hulks. The colonel unclenched his fingers. The mutilated casing fell into the mud, clinking against its sisters.
Listen to my order. Yermakov's voice became steely, official. Collect the casings. Every single one. Bury them. Deep, so not a single dog from the special department catches the scent. In the report, write, ammunition expenditure standard. Firing conducted from a distance of 300 meters with sub-caliber rounds. Savelyev exhaled noisily, as if air was let out of him. The gunner crossed himself, hiding the gesture behind a movement of his hand to his cap. "But, Comrade Colonel," Gromov started. "Silence!" barked Yermakov, but there was no longer icy threat in his eyes. There was something else. Respect. And fatigue. "You think I don't know our shells are crap? You think I like writing death notices? You found a way. Good job. But if anyone finds out, I'll shoot you personally. And myself, too." He stepped toward the Willis, but stopped on the running board, turned around. "Gromov." "Yes?" 450 grams, you say?" "Yes." 450. Remember that number, and teach the others, quietly, in a whisper. But make sure that by tomorrow every gun in the regiment knows how to burn these bastards. Yermakov jumped into the car. The driver hit the gas, and the jeep tore off, covering the crew in dust. Gromov stood and watched the receding car. The tension that had held him all these hours began to release, replaced by monstrous, leaden fatigue. His legs gave way, and he sat right on the ground, leaning his back against the warm wheel of the cannon. They won. They defeated not only the tigers, they defeated the system, forcing it to close its eyes for the sake of effectiveness. This was the hardest victory of the entire war. "Well, men," he said quietly, taking a crumpled pack of Bellamore cigarettes from his pocket. "We live." He lit up.
the cigarette smoke mixed with the smoke of fires.
The war continued, but now they knew its main secret. Sometimes, to do your duty, you have to break the rule. And the price of this violation is measured not in grams of gunpowder, but in the number of heartbeats that continue to beat. War doesn't end when the gun barrel cools down. It simply changes its state of matter, flowing from the hot phase of fire and steel into the cold phase of ink and paper. While Sergeant Gromov smoked on the parapet, trying to calm the trembling in his hands, another battle was beginning in the regimental headquarters, located in a deep dugout 5 kilometers from the front line. The battle for the legalization of victory. Major Sokolov, Chief of Staff, sat over a sheet of paper. A kerosene lamp cast trembling shadows on the table. The dugout smelled of dampness, cheap tobacco, and that special clerical dust that manages to penetrate even to the front. Sokolov held a draft report written in Colonel Yermakov's pencil. The text was dry, but its meaning was like a delayed action fuse. It spoke of 14 destroyed tanks. This was a fantastic figure for July 1943, but the scariest part was in the ammunition expenditure column. There stood numbers that didn't match any standards. Colonel Yermakov decided to risk it. He didn't write about standard means, as he had ordered in the field. He understood. Hiding the scale of such success was impossible, and the lie would be exposed at the first inspection by the trophy team. Therefore, he ordered Sokolov to write the truth, or almost the truth. Use of cumulative shells with reduced charge, range 300 meters, effectiveness 100%. Sokolov understood what he was doing right now. He was signing a document that could become either a commendation list for the entire regiment or an arrest warrant for the command for arbitrariness and violation of main artillery directorate instruction. Changing the construction of a shot in the troops is forbidden under threat of tribunal. This is an axiom. But 14 burned tigers is an argument hard to ignore. Send it, Yermakov said quietly, entering the dugout. He took off his cap, ran a hand through wet hair. Sink or swim. The telegraph operator, a young sergeant with eyes red from lack of sleep, began tapping out Morse code. The clicking of the key was the only sound in the world. Dot, dot, dash. Each dot and dash flew along wires laid through mud, swamps, and craters to Army headquarters. From there to front headquarters, and further to Moscow. The speed of information transmission in that war was a factor just as critical as muzzle velocity. The telegram flew through the night sky, outstripping trains and planes. It carried within it the formula for salvation. Moscow, July 13th, 1943. The building of the People's Commissariat of Defense. Explosions weren't heard here, but the tension was higher than on the Kursk salient. Marshal of Artillery Voronov was reading reports. The picture was grim. Artillery was losing the duel to armor. Reports from the fronts were like a cry of despair. Shells don't penetrate. Losses are growing. Tigers are crushing. And suddenly a cipher from near Prokhorovka lands on the table. Voronov reread it twice. The technical violation was evident. A crude, brazen violation of shot technology. In peacetime, engineers were put on trial for this. But now, war was outside the window. The marshal walked to the map. He saw the scale of the threat. If the Germans broke through the defense, there would be nothing to stop them with. The decision-making mechanism at headquarters worked harshly. There was no room for emotions here. There was only efficiency. Voronov understood the physics of the process. Reducing the charge lowers pressure. The cumulative shell doesn't disintegrate. It reaches the target. It was a solution brilliant in its simplicity, born of the desperation of trench truth. He took a pencil. Blue, thick lead. Prepare a directive, he tossed to the adjutant.
Authorize the use of the method in all anti-tank units, immediately. Distribute instructions by lightning telegram. The bureaucratic machine, usually clumsy and creaky like an ungreased cart, suddenly started working with the RPM of an aviation turbine. It was that rare moment in history when the system worked for self-preservation, casting aside formalism. In 24 hours, work was done that in peacetime would have taken months of testing and approvals. The technical department sketched a diagram for safely unloading casings overnight. The People's Commissariat printing house printed leaflet instructions by morning. Telegraph wires sang again, but now in the opposite direction, top down. From the Kremlin to front HQs, from fronts to armies, from armies to divisions. It was the telegram of life. In the regimental HQ, Yermakov and Sokolov hadn't slept for 2 days. They waited for the answer like a verdict. When the telegraph operator started clicking the key again, receiving an incoming message, it became so quiet in the dugout that a fly beating against the lamp glass could be heard buzzing. The operator wrote letters onto a narrow paper strip. Sokolov read over his shoulder, repeating syllables with his lips. Actions approved. Spread the method. Recommend those who distinguished themselves for awards. Voronov. Yermakov exhaled noisily and slumped onto a stool. The tension that had held his spine like a steel rod for the last 48 hours vanished. Only monstrous fatigue remained. Approved, he whispered. Do you understand, Sokolov? They didn't just forgive. They ordered everyone to do it. It was a victory of common sense over the paragraph. The speed with which Sergeant Gromov's decision traveled from a dirty trench to the marshal's table and returned as an order saved thousands of lives. If bureaucracy had worked as usual, if the paper had been sent around the circle of approvals, German tanks would already be near Kursk. Type the order for the regiment. The colonel's voice became firm again. Gather all battery commanders. Get Gromov to me. Immediately. Now he's not just a sergeant. Now he's, damn it, a professor of the Academy of Artillery Sciences. On the front line, where people slept hugging machine guns, they didn't yet know that a revolution had just occurred in the silence of headquarters. The paperwork flow worked like a combat operation. Paper defeated armor. Now every crew had the official right to gut shells and burn tigers at point-blank range without fearing execution by their own special officers. Gromov, sleeping by the carriage of his gun, woke up from a messenger shaking him. To the regiment commander. Urgent. The sergeant got up, brushing off his greatcoat. He thought he was going under arrest. He didn't know that his violation of regulations had just become new military doctrine. He walked along the trench, looking at the gray morning sky, and thought that today might be his last day. But he had no regrets. 14 black pillars of smoke on the horizon were the best justification for his life. And at this time, all along the front, on hundreds of telegraph machines, ribbons spat out saving words. Authorize. Reduce charge. Shoot. This was, perhaps, the fastest and most effective paperwork in the entire history of the Great Patriotic War. A comma placed in time in the sentence, execute, not pardon, stopped the Wehrmacht's steel avalanche. War does not tolerate classrooms with desks and blackboards. Here, one learns right in the mud, to the accompaniment of explosions, and failing grades are given not by a teacher, but by shrapnel in the chest. Senior Sergeant Gromov no longer belonged to himself. He ceased to be just the commander of one crew. He turned into a nomadic preacher of a new religion, the religion of close combat and truncated charges. The Willis bounced on bumps. Gromov held onto the windshield frame, swallowing dust. He traveled all along the arc, from battery to battery, carrying knowledge that just yesterday was considered criminal. He was met warily. Commanders of other crews, exhausted, angry, having lost half their men, looked at him from under their brows. Some sergeant is going to teach them how to fight? He jumped out of the car without wasting time on greetings. In his hands, that very castrated shell. "Assemble personnel," he rasped. His voice was long gone from constant shouting and smoke. They gathered around him in the trench. Faces gray, eyes inflamed. They expected a miracle, but Gromov offered them hard work and mortal risk. "Look here." Gromov took a piece of chalk, or just a piece of brick, and drew right on the gun shield, or on a soot-covered board of an ammo crate. "Here is your enemy. Tiger. Armor, 100 millimeters. Our standard from a kilometer, like peas against a wall. You know this. You've seen your comrades burn." The crowd buzzed dully. They knew. They had seen it too often. "And this," he raised the modified shell, "is its death. But this death has short arms. 300 meters, remember? 300. Not 500, not 400. 300. A whisper of horror ran through the ranks. Letting a tiger within 300 meters meant seeing the driver-mechanic's eyes through the vision slit. It meant withstanding psychological pressure from which blood vessels in the eyes burst. Regulations required opening fire from a kilometer to have a chance for a second shot. Gromov demanded waiting until the last moment to have a guarantee for the first. "Scared?" he asked, looking into the eyes of a young gunner. "I'm scared too, but if you shoot earlier, you die. If you miss, you die. This shell flies slowly. You have to place it carefully, like a letter in the mailbox." He showed how to gut the casings. It was war surgery. Dirty fingers of soldiers learned gentle, delicate movements. Unbend, pour off, weigh in hand. 450 grams. This number became a password. Gromov made them repeat it in chorus, like a prayer. A mistake in weight? Death of the crew. "Don't be afraid of the pff," he explained the sound of the shot. "It doesn't bang. It spits. But this spit burns steel right through." On the neighboring sector of the front, where Gromov conducted instruction 2 days ago, statistics were already creeping up. The loss curve, which used to shoot into the sky like a vertical wall, began to break. Crews stopped panicking. Anger appeared. The anger of a craftsman who finally got the right tool. They learned not on plywood targets. They learned on live tanks. Gromov stood next to gunners in battle when the earth shook. "Too early!" he screamed, drowning out the roar of engines, and hit the gunner on the shoulder, holding him back from firing. "Wait! Wait, damn it!" The German tank filled the whole world. It seemed it would drive right onto the barrel. Nerves sang like taut barbed wire, and only when the muzzle brake of the German gun hung over the parapet did the command follow. "Now!" Pop, flash, and the multi-ton behemoth stopped, choking on its own fire. The cumulative jet did its job quietly and terribly. This experience spread with the speed of a forest fire. The Gromov method ceased to be the secret of one regiment. It was copied in neighboring divisions. Artillerymen passed the secret of 450 grams to each other, along with tobacco and alcohol. It was folk engineering thought multiplied by mass heroism. Wehrmacht tank wedges, accustomed to cracking defenses with the blow of an armored fist, suddenly hit an invisible wall. They went forward, confident in invulnerability, and burned at pistol-shot range. German tankers in their letters home, which were later found in the map cases of the killed, wrote about a new Russian wonder cannon. They didn't know the cannon was old. The thinking was new. Gromov saw people change. Yesterday's boys, who prayed at the sight of a tiger, now looked at tanks appraisingly, like a butcher looks at a carcass. Where to hit? Under the turret or in the side? Fear disappeared. Calculation remained. In 2 weeks of fighting, statistics changed radically. If in early July, for 1 destroyed German tank, there were 5 lost Soviet guns, now this ratio became 2 to 1. We still paid in blood, but now this payment wasn't in vain. We began to trade profitably. The domino effect worked. One successful idea, picked up by thousands of hands, broke the back of the German tank offensive. The battlefield near Kursk, Prokhorovka, Belgorod, was covered with black hulks. 2,300. This figure, voiced later in Soviet Information Bureau reports, sounded dry. 2,300 destroyed enemy tanks and self-propelled guns. But behind this number stood not only heroism, behind it stood mountains of modified casings, tons of hand-poured gunpowder, and that very risk of a barrel burst for the sake of one accurate hit. Gromov stood on the edge of another trench, watching a crew skillfully gutting ammo. He didn't interfere anymore. They knew what to do. The mechanism was launched. Technical impotence was replaced by technical superiority, won by ingenuity and violation of all conceivable instructions. War continued, but the turning point in consciousness had already occurred. Artillery became the god of war again, albeit smeared with soot, with pliers in hand instead of a scepter. Gromov wiped sweat from his forehead. He needed to drive further, to the next regiment. Teach, show, explain. Because iron can be remelted, but people cannot. And every crew taught by him meant saved lives that would reach Berlin. The road to the west wasn't a straight line on a map. It was measured not in kilometers, but in the amount of burnt gunpowder and field dressings. The path from the scorched steppe near Prokhorovka to the cobblestones of Europe took almost 2 years of continuous hard labor. Gromov walked this road, leaving behind graveyards of machinery and his men. He changed. War weathered everything superfluous out of him, leaving only bare functionality. 3 times he was put out of action. The first time, shrapnel in the hip near Kiev. The second time, concussion near Warsaw, when blood came from his ears and the world went silent for 2 weeks. The third time, a bullet in the chest right at the border with Germany. Hospitals were just repair shops for him. Just as machinery is driven into a bay to replace components, so his body was darned by surgeons to send him back to the front line. Human resource was expended just as cynically as barrel resource. On his tunic, faded from sun and washing in gasoline, a gold star appeared. It hung next to a hole from shrapnel sewn up with rough thread. The metal of the award struck against "For Courage" medals, creating a quiet jingling when walking. But Gromov didn't feel like a poster hero. He felt like an old mechanism whose warranty period was ending. He was a little over 30, but he looked 50. Deep wrinkles cut his face. Ingrained gunpowder soot became part of his skin pigmentation. May 1945, Berlin. This was no longer the war of the steppes. There was no horizon here. War became vertical. Street fighting in a stone sack, where death could fly from any window, from a basement, from the sewers. The air of Berlin consisted of brick dust. It clogged nostrils, gritted on teeth, turned lungs into a cement plant. Gromov now commanded not a crew, but a combined artillery assault group. Their tactics changed. Instead of elegant duels at distance, brute force of destruction worked here. Large calibers were rolled out for direct fire. 122mm howitzers and heavy 203mm Stalin's sledgehammers looked point-blank at facades of houses turned into fortresses. Physics here was simple. The kinetic energy of a concrete-piercing shell weighing 100 kilograms left a wall no chance upon meeting brickwork. Impact, collapse, dust cloud. Gromov stood in the opening of a shattered shop window. Soldiers bustled around him, moving crates.
The roar was such that orders were given by gestures.
"Third floor! Machine gun!" He pointed to a window of the house opposite, from where angry bursts were coming. Trails swung around. Clang of the breech. No need to pour off powder here. Here a full charge was needed to take out the floor entirely. A howitzer shot in a narrow street is an acoustic blow that can stop a heart. Windows in neighboring houses blew out 3 days ago. Now, the frame of the universe itself was blowing out. The shell entered the window. The explosion inside the building spat out furniture, pieces of walls, and people. The machine gun fell silent. They gnawed through the defense, meter by meter. Berlin resisted with the agony of a beast cornered. Faustniks! Boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm burned tanks from basements. But against heavy artillery, they had no arguments. Gromov saw the city's architecture change.
Majestic buildings turned into piles of rubble, over which IS-2 tanks crawled. In the Tiergarten Park, he saw them again. Tigers. But now they were king tigers, monsters weighing 70 tons. They stood dug into the ground at intersections, and again, like 2 years ago, Gromov felt that cold excitement. "Armor-piercing, under the turret!" His voice was calm. He knew the anatomy of these machines. He knew where their fuel tanks were, where the ammo rack was. The experience of 43 multiplied by the power of 45 gave a terrible result. One shot, and the turret of the German giant froze forever. May 2nd. Silence came suddenly, like concussion. Shooting ceased. The Berlin garrison capitulated. Gromov walked toward the Reichstag. The parliament building, pitted by thousands of shrapnel hits, was smoking. The dome looked like a skeleton. The square in front of it was littered with machinery and bodies. But Gromov didn't look at his feet. He looked at the columns. They were speckled with inscriptions, thousands of names. Chalk, charcoal, paint, bayonet knife. Here the living signed for the dead. Here they put a period in a huge, bloody sentence written over 4 years. Gromov walked up to one of the columns. There was almost no free space. He bent down, picked up a piece of charred wood from the ground, maybe a remnant of a rifle butt, maybe a piece of furniture. It was warm. The hand that 2 years ago trembled while pouring gunpowder from a casing was now steady. He raised his hand as high as he could reach. On the rough sandstone pockmarked by bullets, black, bold letters appeared. Gromov. He didn't write his rank, didn't write his city, didn't write, "We made it." Just the surname. It was a receipt of delivery. He got his life back. He survived. Against statistics, against ballistics, against everything. "Comrade Sergeant Major!" A ringing young voice called him. Gromov turned. Before him stood a group of young soldiers, reinforcements. Tunics brand new, unbroken in, boots shining. They looked at him with awe. For them, he was a legend, an ancient warrior coming from times they had only read about in reports. They saw his awards, saw the gray at his temples, saw this terrible, heavy aura of a man who killed and survived too long. "Are you Gromov? That one? Who burned tigers?" one of them asked, eyes wide open. "Tell us how it was." Gromov looked at them. There was the delight of victory in their eyes.
They didn't see the dirt, blood, guts wrapped around tracks. They saw a flag over a roof. And he didn't want to destroy their illusion. He threw away the piece of charcoal, wiped his black hand on his trousers. "How was it?" he asked back quietly. "It was loud and dirty." He looked at the inscription on the column, black charcoal on gray stone. "And now, sons, let me pass. I want to sleep."
Haven't slept for 4 years. He walked through the crowd of jubilant soldiers like an icebreaker through thin ice. Around him they shouted, "Hurrah!" fired machine guns into the air, drank alcohol from flasks. An accordion played, and Gromov walked to his Willis, feeling terrible, leaden fatigue finally catching up with him. He sat on the seat, threw his head back, and closed his eyes. The noise of the celebration began to recede, turning into a steady hum. Before his mind's eye, there was no Reichstag. There was the scorched field near Prokhorovka, the smell of wormwood, and the clang of a bolt. The path was finished. The physics of war completed its cycle. The potential energy of hatred turned into the kinetic energy of the strike, and now dissipated as the heat of victory. Only an echo remained, and a charcoal signature on stone that would stand for centuries. 1965, the Urals. The heavy machinery plant hummed like a huge hive, but this wasn't the hum that burst eardrums near Kursk. Here the sound was steady, low frequency, creative. The thundering of multi-ton presses, the screech of milling cutters, the hiss of pneumatics. This was the symphony of industrialization, the music of a restored country. Gromov stood by a vertical lathe. He had aged. His hair had turned white, like that very ash of Berlin, but his back remained straight as a gun barrel. He wore not a tunic, but greasy overalls. In his hands, not a shell, but a micrometer. He was measuring tolerances on a huge steel part for a hydroelectric station turbine. Precision, 5 microns. Error is inadmissible. His hands remembered a different precision. Precision when life depended on 450 grams of gunpowder. Sometimes, when the shift ended and the shop emptied, Gromov caught himself thinking that the machine reminded him of a gun breech. The same cold metal, the same smell of oil, the same feeling of hidden power. Only now this power worked for light, not darkness. He didn't like speaking at meetings. When asked to tell about the war, he withdrew. What could he tell pioneers in clean neckties? About how a man gets wrapped around a track? About how he violated orders to survive? About how burnt human meat smells mixed with diesel? No, that wasn't the truth they wanted to hear. They wanted stories of heroism, and he had a story of hard, dirty work. Gromov simply worked. He taught young turners not beautiful slogans, but a feel for metal. "Steel, it's alive," he would say in a raspy voice, stroking a cutting tool. "If you fear it, it will break you. If you respect it, it will become plasticine. Don't push. Feel the resistance." In 1978, the mechanism stopped. Gromov's heart, worn out by the overloads of war and peace, simply stopped pumping blood. He died quietly, in his sleep, without pompous speeches and salutes. He simply left for that dark dugout of eternity where the guys from 43 were waiting for him. But physics is a stubborn science. The law of conservation of energy states, nothing disappears without a trace. The energy of Gromov's thought, his engineering audacity, didn't go into the ground with his body. It transformed. 2023. A closed design bureau in Moscow. Silence. It doesn't smell of oil here,
It smells of ozone from running servers and expensive coffee. Instead of lathes, powerful graphic stations. The light of lamps is cold, sterile. At a monitor sits a young guy. He isn't even 30. On his badge, the surname Gromov. Viktor Gromov, grandson. On the screen, a three-dimensional model of a new kinetic interceptor. Complex geometry, alloys based on tungsten and depleted uranium. Viktor rotates the model with a mouse, checking the centering. He is the lead ballistics engineer. Before him stands a task that seems unsolvable. The new active protection of likely enemy tanks shoots down all known types of projectiles. A breakthrough is needed. Something is needed that will trick radars, that will pass through protection like a knife through butter. Viktor leans back in his chair. He rubs the bridge of his nose, tired from the monitor. Formulas spin in his head. Speed, mass, cross-section, atmospheric density. Standard solutions don't work. Increasing speed is impossible. The casing melts. Increasing mass, range drops. Dead end. He opens a desk drawer. There, among flash drives and blueprints, lies a strange souvenir. An old brass casing from a 76mm shell, darkened by time. The edges of its neck are uneven, with traces of rough work with pliers. A family heirloom. Grandfather brought it from the war as an ashtray, but never flicked ash into it. Viktor takes the casing in his hands. It cools his fingers. He knows the story of this casing. His father told him the legend of 450 grams. Of how his grandfather violated the laws of physics and military regulations to burn tigers. If direct logic leads to a dead end, thinks Viktor, turning the casing, then axioms need to be changed. The engineer's gaze focuses on the monitor. What if the stabilization principle is changed? What if the projectile spins not clockwise, but counterclockwise, creating a turbulent wake that confuses protection sensors? This contradicts all aerodynamics textbooks. It will create monstrous vibrations. It is a risk of the product breaking apart at launch. But it might work. Viktor smiles. It's not the smile of a merry man. It's the smile of a predator who has seen the victim's vulnerability. It is the same smile Senior Sergeant Gromov had in the trench near Prokhorovka. He pulls the keyboard closer. Fingers begin quickly typing new parameters into the simulation. He decreases the rifling pitch. He changes the weight distribution. He goes against rules written in technical assignments. On the screen, an inscription lights up. Probability of overcoming protection, 98%. Engineering thought has made a full turn on the spiral of time. From a dirty trench where a sergeant poured off gunpowder by eye with dirty hands, to a sterile office where his grandson rewrites flight control program code. Tools have changed. The essence remains the same. War is not only a clash of armies, it is a clash of intellects. It is an eternal duel between shield and sword, between armor and shell. And in this duel, the winner is not the one with the thicker forehead, but the one whose mind is sharper. Ingenuity. In the West, this word is translated as cunning or a funny trick, but they don't understand the essence. Ingenuity is the ability of an engineer to see hidden reserves in matter. It is the skill to turn a disadvantage into an advantage. It is the readiness to take responsibility for breaking rules for the sake of a higher goal. Efficiency. 14 burned tigers in 43. A breakthrough in hypersonic technologies in 23. These are links in one chain, a chain forged from the Russian character, which does not recognize the word impossible. Viktor saves the project. The file goes to the factory server. Tomorrow morning in workshops similar to the one where his grandfather worked, CNC machines will start carving parts for the new product. Metal will scream under the cutter again, submitting to human will. The story of Senior Sergeant Gromov didn't end in 45. It didn't end in 78. It continues in every blueprint, in every new alloy, in every bold decision of designers who know. Regulations are written in ink, but history is written in deeds. One man who risked violating instructions saved a battalion. His idea, becoming a directive, saved a front. His spirit, passed down through a generation, continues to guard the country. The echo of that shot from the ZiS-3 still sounds. Only now it sounds not like a shot. It sounds like the roar of a rocket engine rising into the sky.